In this video, we are going to write a method that will find an existing URL, if there is one, in the text view, obtain a tiny URL, and replace the existing URL with a tiny one. Once we finish this method, we will have completed the TwitterMe application. To accomplish this, we will be using the NSScanner class. I have the method ready to go, and we will walk through it line by line and explain how each one works. We're in the createTinyURL method. In our first line, we're going to set two integer variables, a starting index and an ending index. These variables are used to create the NS range we'll need to replace the current URL with the tiny URL. Next, we are creating an NS error and setting its initial value to nil. Remember, we learned a valuable lesson in our earlier video when we had not initialized this variable. No need to make that mistake twice. We are using that same reasoning when we create the NS string. Here we need a fully instantiated NS string so that we can pass it by reference to the scan up to characters from set into string method. The next line is where we instantiate an NSScanner object and use its class method scannerWithString using the TextViewString as the parameter. The NS character set will be used to find the end of the URL string. We are using the whitespace and newLineCharacterSet class method. The definition we are going to use as the end of a URL is going to be either a newline character or whitespace. Either one of these will signify the end of the URL. Next, we begin to search the string for the characters http://. As you can see, we are only searching for this one URL prefix. You could change this to use an NS character set and add additional URL prefixes if you prefer. We scan up to the HTTP. If it is found, then the characters preceding the HTTP will be discarded. We do this by passing nil as the parameter to intoString. We then set the starting index to the scanner's current location in the string. Our next line uses scan up to characters from set into string method. The string that is found is inserted into the foundURL variable. Again, we set the ending index to the scanner's current location. These two variables, starting index and ending index, now hold the starting and ending location of the found URL. Now we check the found URL to see if a URL was found. If a URL was not found, we do nothing. If one was found, we create an NS range by setting its location to the starting index and the length to the number of characters contained by the URL. To do this, we simply subtract the starting index from the ending index. After that, we create the tinyURL API string that will return as a tiny URL. Once we have the string created, we need to create a legal URL string. We do that with string by adding %escapes using encoding. We've used this method before. Next, we create an NSURL. This is what is required by the NSString method, string with contents of URL encoding error, that we'll use next. In this method, the contents of the URL are returned and stored in the variable tinyURL. The tinyURL API returns only the tiny URL, so there is no parsing required like there was with the Twitter API. Also notice that we are not having to use NSTask or curl to get the contents of a web page. NSString can do this as well. I do want to make a note here about this. I chose NSString for this task not only to demonstrate its use, but because the task itself is so small, it seemed like the best fit. After that, we checked to ensure that there were no errors retrieving the tiny URL. If there were no errors, then we replace the current URL with the tiny one. We do this by calling NSTextViews replaceCharactersInRange with string method, passing in the URL range we created at the beginning of this method and the tiny URL. If there was an error, we report it back to the user with a modal dialog. That's all there is to replacing an existing URL with a tiny one. One thing to note is that this will only work on the first URL the scanner encounters. Now I think it's time to build and run and enjoy our finished application. And when I click the tiny URL button, we get a tiny URL in its place.